Hello and welcome back to The Walking Dead Retrospective, where today, after nearly 3 long years, we are finally entering the final stretch of the mainline series. Season 11, the surprise cancellation, and the now quite decisive arcs it entails. For reasons we've now spent a very long time discussing, the stories have diverged to such a degree that we're going to be talking a whole lot more about the select similarities rather than the countless differences. All that said, we've got lots to talk about, so without further ado, let's jump right in. As always, a new season means a look at the wider state of the franchise going into the final season, something that will of course be very fresh on many of our minds. I guess to set a baseline theme for everything we'll be talking about, the one word I would use to describe the production and the story of the final season is just messy. So let's unpack that. First and foremost, Season 11 is of course coming off of the very odd delays that happened as a result of the Great Plague. So naturally, buzz surrounding the series was in a very odd place, not just because of the show, but because, well, everything was in a very uncertain place. Combine that with the somewhat lackluster extension of Season 10, the unusually early release date of August, the early release of AMC+, the now many confirmed spin-offs implying many characters' survival, and the fact that Rick and Michonne were still nowhere to be seen, well, let's just say that it was an odd season right from the get-go. What made it even more odd is the sudden announcement that it would in fact be 24 episodes. A first for The Walking Dead that, with the exception of Season 10 and that extension, had been sticking to a 16-episode structure for the better part of a decade. This whole extension is a bit of a double-edged sword, as giving the Commonwealth more time to breathe and generally giving the show a more fleshed-out send-off was certainly a welcome decision. But at the same time, many, including myself, long thought that the series simply didn't even need 16-episode seasons, and that the extension would actually do more bad than good. Especially considering how prolific bottle episodes were already and how little comic story we had left. And the thing is, we weren't the only ones left in the dark, because if thus far the series had been smooth sailing without any worries of cancellations, then with Season 11, the producers hit a brick wall, because we now know that the reason for the 24-episode season is just that, a cancellation. And sure, whether you want to call it that or just an amicable agreement between AMC and the production team is up to you. But what matters is that originally, Season 11 was not meant to be the final season. So in light of that, me calling it messy is not just because I do genuinely think that the season feels like separate stories oddly slotted together that somehow managed to run into the same exact problems that the comic does, but also because the messy production side sort of explains why that is the case. In the same way that Season 2's pacing felt extremely odd because we know that it was a complete mess, the same goes for Season 11. Chances are that the Reapers were originally meant to play a much larger role, but were rather relegated to some C-tier baddie group with very little going for them. Ditto for the entire Oceanside subplot that was handled off-screen and eventually confirmed by Angela Kang herself, literally outside of the show. Ditto for the Intelligent Walkers that are, at the absolute most, retconned in to function as some weird pseudo-advertisement for the spin-offs. And the same goes for the many interpersonal storylines which seem to develop in some very odd directions. So yes, in short, the structure of the season, the expectations going into it, and even how people view it, with there now being a clear separation between the early AMC Plus viewers and the regular viewers, was already far different from what we'd grown to expect. And in terms of hype, from my personal observations that were obviously not wholly representative, but I think are at least worth bringing up, Season 11, despite being the final season of the now decade-plus long show, had the absolute least amount of buzz around it. Be it due to the aforementioned division into the haves and have-nots with AMC+, and most of the world not even being able to legally view it, the lasting fatigue from the pandemic and apocalyptic shows just not having the same appeal, simply because the quality had slipped, or any other number of reasons. So now that we've talked about the many oddities of adapting this season, let's look at what it actually adapts, those being issues 175 through 193. As with many of the later seasons, the 0.75 issues per episode figure is extremely deceptive. As again, only the large overarching themes are the same and everything else surrounding it is not even comparable. On top of that, the Commonwealth in the comic is notoriously rushed and comparatively action-centric, something that would of course make it very hard to adapt for a whole season. Many of the arcs, even within the Commonwealth itself, are entirely added for the show, while many comic ones are just removed outright. So yes, by the numbers, it is a slow season, but really, it doesn't say much considering how the actual story shapes out. Purely comic material-wise, it lands between the pacing of Seasons 7 and 8. so feel free to compare how that would feel in your mind, but we'll of course return to this question of pacing plenty more throughout the season. And the final thing I want to look at before I jump into the story is the promotional material for the season. And with the posters, I have to say, the first ones that were released for the season are probably some of my least favorite in the entire show. I think it's just bland more than anything else. This poster could be for Season 9, it could be for Season 10, it could be for Season 11, Part 1, could be Part 2. It's just forgettable and boring. And ditto for the overall composition of the poster itself. Looking at all the greats of early Walking Dead, the Atlanta poster has Rick be the small, insignificant speck riding into the impossibly big city. It immediately gives the world this almost scary scale. Season 2 has Rick running to the barn, again not even focusing on him, but rather the environment he is in. Clearly, he appears to be in distress, he is alone, and the overall look is dark and grimy. Hehe, get it? Grimy, as in Grimes? Season 3, my favorite poster of all time by the way, has Rick atop the bus, again putting the emphasis on the prison while Rick is a lone guardian holding up the gun. He is no longer riding into a scary city, he is no longer running. He is now framed as the last man standing with his gun up. Season 4 has the prison fences breached. Rick's right hand is all bandaged up, and he is holding onto the revolver with his left. It shows us the collapse of what we once thought to be the perfect hiding place. But again, while Rick is there, he is not the focus, it's the prison. Season 5 is where that shifts, and we now see Rick portrayed as the predator hiding in the foliage. It's depicting that monster that now lives within each member of the group. They have lost their sanctuary, Terminus is a mousetrap, and so now we find ourselves being the hunters. Ditto for the second half of the season, where we reflect on the road thus far with the famous "The New World's Going to Need Rick Grimes" map. It's again about the message and the environment of where we are. I could go through all of them one by one, as I think they're all extremely effective in conveying the season's themes. But just to not waste any more time, I think you see what I'm getting at. These posters for Season 11 shouldn't have been posters, they should have just been character shots, because this tells you nothing. It's personality-less, it's just a generic-looking collection of dudes standing in some fog and some weirdly CGI'd walker hands at the bottom. If you want character-centric posters, things like Breaking Bad, House of the Dragon, even earlier Walking Dead itself all managed to incorporate character into their promo. But this just feels quite soulless to me. The trailer, on the other hand, well, there we have an entirely different situation. If you recall what I've said about some of the trailers from the Season 8 to 10 era, I've said a bunch of them feel too modern, if that makes sense. The framing, the obligatory comedic punchline, the music, it just didn't have that Walking Dead vibe. Well, this one, I think is like 75% back to form. The music choice is really cool, the overall tenseness is great, and the tonal shift halfway through is just chef's kiss. I think it perfectly fits into that beautiful Season 3 to 4 trailer formula, with the first half exploring the character side and the second that danger/antagonist/disaster/whatever else side of the story.
Of all the money e'er I had.
Welcome to Woodbury.
What we have, it's rare.
Done worse.
In hindsight, much of it is severely devalued for me because, well, the Reapers are an absolute joke, but taking the trailer in isolation, they absolutely cooked with this one. The only real nitpick I have with it is that it once again does the now extremely overdone thing of just splicing in a bunch of completely meaningless bits of very deep dialogue over certain events as if there was some sort of speech quota that had to be met. Again, if you look back at the Season 3 trailer for example, Rick's speech, Beth's singing, and eventually the governor's speech are all used very sparingly. They are the backbone of the narrative that the trailer is telling, whereas this one just feels a little bit all over the place. Okay, I do have another nitpick with this one, and that is once again the Negan-Maggie stuff, which very much makes me roll my eyes at this point. But okay, we'll talk about it plenty more throughout the season, so we'll leave it at that. Overall though, in my opinion, a great trailer, and the little Commonwealth bit at the end is just genius.
I'm Slippin' Jimmy.
Welcome to the Commonwealth.
Moving into the story itself, before we get to the show and all the Commonwealth business, in what is a classic Kirkman move between the first appearance of the Stormtroopers and the proper introduction to the Commonwealth, he slipped in a little Negan solo issue. Why? Well, because it's Kirkman, the man who thought about killing Rick Grimes just to mess with people. Jokes aside though, I think the intention here is to establish the starkest of contrasts between Negan and Rick. The survivors just met the Commonwealth, a community with over 50,000 people, a dedicated militia with actually legit equipment, and generally something as close to a pre-apocalyptic society that you could imagine. Negan, on the other hand, is completely alone. Even the people who hated him have now tossed him aside as if he's not even worth the revenge. It very blatantly shows us that Negan's Iron Fist leadership and every single horrific thing he did, despite him saving Rick a number of times during the war, has never and will never be forgiven. Where he once thought himself to be the king of the new world, he now finds himself living in a small suburb alone, just caring for a single grave. If you read through the letter hacks, those are basically Q&A sessions, Kirkman's opinion on what should have happened to Negan after the war and in the issue we're about to talk about seems to have always been split right down the middle. Leaving Negan alive is both an act of mercy as well as just about the cruelest thing you could do to someone like Negan, right? Much like people, even today, debate what should have happened to Negan in the show, the comic leans into that by leaving his fate somewhat ambiguous. Yeah, sure, he is never killed, but does he actually ever live? Oh, and in the same letter hacks, Kirkman also talks about how he knows exactly what's going to happen in issue 200, and later he also talks about issue 300. Yeah. But alright, before we get stuck in the weeds, let's get to the actual story, which, like I said, is all about Negan. We see him yoink a cool-looking sunflower, all while babbling about anything and everything to himself. While still talking on and on, he returns to Lucille's grave and rests the sunflower upon it, saying that he thinks about her all the time, adding that he knows she wasn't much into flowers, but that people change after the end of the world, saying maybe you would have grown to appreciate the little beauty in this ugly world. I think all of this is pretty blatantly telling us that Negan just misses people. He's a lonely, broken man with nothing to his name except a buried bat. And what I think is done beautifully here is that hatred for himself that just keeps bubbling up, with him then saying, you probably would have done things differently, would have been smarter about things. You probably wouldn't have ended up alone. But just like that, he also says, no, I'm stronger than this, and then just asks, same time tomorrow? Good. It's this constant bargaining with himself where that human weakness begins to shine through, but then that survivor retakes control as he tells himself that, no, I am stronger than this. He doesn't allow himself to feel anything, he has no one to share these feelings with. So the only thing he can do is just try to convince himself that everything is fine, even though clearly it's not. Just like we've been talking with all the Negan scenes in the Whisperer War, none of this is meant to redeem him in any way. All it does is show us that there is a person underneath that ruthless leader of the Saviors. One with the same insecurities, same pain, and same loss that Rick himself has dealt with and is dealing with even right now. They are both extremely strong, both are or were leaders of hundreds, but in the face of death, both are equally scared and alone. And also once again, these comparisons between Rick and Negan do not mean that they are the same, it's just paralleling their stories. I don't know why this comparison keeps getting brought up. Yes, Kirkman is deliberately paralleling them, but they are not the same. That is not the point. You can parallel very, very different characters. We then see him walk to his little house, one which he would never leave again, by the way. I think if the show had wrapped up Negan's story with Here's Negan, we'd be having these same conversations there. But alas, keep your friends close, but your enemies closer. Wow. My bitterness aside, we see him then shoot a dog, but apologizing to it. And then at Lucille's grave, once again saying that he still feels bad, but saying, I was starving and it didn't even taste good. He also finds this off-road truck filled with food, which may or may not be a slight nod to the entire Jesus escapade from the show. Though we then get to the really interesting stuff. He searches this barn, only to spot a single baseball bat rested in the corner. And upon seeing it, he just mumbles, no, no, no. He doesn't take it, later recounting the event to Lucille and saying that he could never replace her. But soon thereafter, he rushes over to the barn after all, thrusting the bat into the air and proclaiming that I am young again and I want to live. If this were a musical tragedy drama, this is where you'd hear that stinger accentuating the moment. I think you can interpret this sudden twist in a number of different ways. The way I read it is that Negan tries getting closer to Lucille by replacing the bats. Think of it in the same way as you might hold on to a pet's toy after they've passed. It's just a physical representation of what you've lost. It's that one thing you can still hold on to. Just like Negan himself says, he knows he can replace the bats, but he could never replace Lucille. But even then, he tries replicating it just to get a teeny bit of closure for himself. He knows it means nothing, but he desperately wants it. But as he sits there, wrapping it with the barbed wire, Maggie, who has had Dante tracking Negan ever since he left Alexandria, pops up behind him. Clearly, not getting the best of first impressions. What we see here is basically what the show already had in Season 9, with Maggie going into Alexandria to kill Negan. Only, you know, the comic doesn't drag it out over 4 seasons across 2 shows. My saltiness aside, Negan here once again repeats much of what we already heard. He says that, of course, he remembers her, and that in this world it's a luxury to live long enough to regret the things he's done. He simply apologizes and says that I'm not going to fight back. Naturally, Maggie is furious with him seemingly trying to ask for sympathy, but he just says, no, I'm not proud of what I did, but I did it willingly. I believed it needed to be done. Like we saw in Here's Negan and the countless people that just kept dying all around him, he says that after a while, killing a few people to ensure that his own, some of which he actually liked, may survive was a very easy trade. Then saying that it wasn't until Rick showed him another way that he realized just how much he had messed up. He goes on to say a whole lot more, but then just says that if Glenn was your Lucille, well, then I know that pain all too well. Though don't forget, this is still Kirkman and this is still The Walking Dead. So Maggie then asks, do you still hear her voice? Do you still see her face? To which Negan says, clear as day. Only for Maggie to then bluntly say, every time I try to picture Glenn's face, I see him on the ground screaming my name. I hear his voice garbled in agony. That is my memory of him. And with that, I see you, smiling. So yeah, not exactly the heart-to-heart you might expect, and most certainly not even the tiniest hint of Negan ever being accepted back into the survivors. Just like the show, Negan just begs for her to shoot him, trying to anger her further by saying that he could do what he did again, but eventually just again breaking down completely and asking why not? Though Maggie simply turns around and says that she's not going to give him what he wants and that he's going to have to live with what he's done. Before leaving, she even turns to shoot a few of the walkers that would lunge at Negan while he's still stunned. And in this moment of pure catharsis, Maggie kisses Dante, just saying, let's go home. I think this is her, as much as she can, finally putting Negan behind her. She will never forgive him, she will never talk to him, she will never interact with him in any single way. But she will also finally stop torturing herself with that memory. As to whether or not Kirkman was being serious about Maggie shooting Negan is up to you, but I think this is just about the most perfect ending his character could have gotten. It's not happy, it's not sad, it's just him alone. He finishes wrapping the bat, but then throws it into the fire, not even bothering to look back. This is it for Negan's story. A new version of himself is forged through the fiery death of some pseudo-Lucille. This Negan will spend the rest of his days simply caring for the grave and reflecting on the things he's done. And I mean that very literally. In the final issue 20 years later, Negan has not moved away from the single house and we never see him. Even with society being largely rebuilt, he never shows his face to anyone and simply cares for the grave. I think the beautiful thing about Negan's story is that eventually we understand him. We see that people do change, we see just how hurt he was. We even see him try to desperately plead for forgiveness. But this is not a fairy tale. He has done horrible, horrible things. I don't mean to start a philosophical debate about people reforming and all that. I'm not smart enough to do that, unfortunately. But I think Negan's story is about how not everyone gets to be redeemed and be the hero in the end. Like I said during the Whisperer War, Kirkman made us understand how Negan became Negan. He showed us just how damaged he was and is. But by having Maggie be the last one to ever see Negan in the comic, it reminds us of the terrible things he did to make us ask whether we can ever forgive him. The Walking Dead is a story about people, and now we've seen both sides. So what do we think of Negan once it's all over and done with? I think that is why I get so incredibly annoyed with AMC's persistence to just keep dragging on the Maggie Negan conflict so much. By having this whole, I will never forgive you but we need to work together shtick 50 different times, I think it severely devalues the journey these characters have walked and the burden each of them carry, especially Maggie. If the comic felt like a bittersweet end to their stories, with both finding at least the tiniest bits of peace, then the show feels like this weird fanfiction where someone just keeps shipping these characters. The purpose of their stories is how Negan keeps holding on to the past, but Maggie finally moves on. The show, on the other hand, just tries spoon-feeding you the story of how Maggie, rightfully so by the way, hates Negan. But at a certain point, that supposed hatred genuinely feels like a nuisance to her at most. Like, seriously, watch Dead City and like Lucifer Season 1 or just about any of these shows with the quote-unquote good cop being paired with a chaotic one back-to-back and try telling me that Negan doesn't have that same shtick. It naturally breeds a ton of banter and works extremely well for many of these stories. But why are we tying together someone who literally witnessed just about the worst kind of trauma imaginable to the dude inflicting said trauma? it feels almost comedic. But okay, I could ramble on about this for hours. Say goodbye to Negan because this is the last time we'll be seeing him. Well, actually, that is a lie, because technically there is Negan Lives, but that was released like way later, and it's not relevant now, and we'll talk about that eventually, but that doesn't count, so basically, yeah, we're not gonna see Negan again. Finally, moving into the show, we open the season on Daryl's wings, which are of course really cool. But we then move right into the raid on the military outpost, sort of like what we saw in Season 4 with the big spots. In terms of comic parallels, there really are none. Absolutely everything on this side of the story is added for the show. Which also brings me onto the bigger point about how this whole thing is framed. The basis of this whole idea is that inside there are a bunch of lurkers, so we don't really know how many of them are actually alive. With that in mind, we rappel down to yoink as much stuff as we can, and then escape in classic spy-like fashion. Broadly speaking, it is a pretty neat juxtaposition to the rest of the story, with the Commonwealth story establishing this stark contrast between the struggle of survival and the oddly mundane life that is living within this community of 50,000. But at the same time, I've always found this whole mission as the most over-designed strategy for no other reason than spectacle for the show. I mean, of course, yes, this is still a story, so let's just try something new. But at the same time, there is again that suspension of disbelief angle. Surely I'm not the only one thinking that just creating a choke point and slowly kiting the walkers out, as we've done countless times, is a far smarter bet, right? Sending in a handful of people using equipment that literally breaks halfway through, and then blasting down the rest of the walkers with firearms just doesn't really seem like 10 years of survival experience now, does it? Which, by the way, what was the contingency plan here? I don't think there was one. As for Alexandria, sorta like the comic, the community is in ruin, only the show leans into this idea far more. The comic more so treated this as No Way Out 2.0, where some repairs are needed, but it's not like the entire community has been burned down. Don't forget that in the comic, the Whisperers themselves actually don't attack Alexandria. I think the show deliberately tried leaning into this angle of Alexandria and the survivors barely holding on, while the Commonwealth has to worry about the most trivial of things like money and status. I think it does later work really well with Daryl, Judith, and all that story. But at the start of the season, it just feels like the survivors are once again extremely flip-floppy in their capabilities and skill. Another thing we see here is of course Maggie introducing the Reapers, which in hindsight very much makes me roll my eyes here, because here we go again. We just spent most of Season 10 watching Carol pursue what is largely a personal act of revenge. Well, now we have Maggie showing up and retconning in a group of baddies we've never even seen before and just telling us we have to fight them. I think all of this harkens back to that surprise cancellation, because I just refuse to believe that anyone thought in writing this random group of baddies to explain Maggie's absence only to wrap it up in some meaningless shootout was a good idea. If Season 11 was originally all about the Reapers, then maybe it could have worked. Otherwise, this just seems like the second blatant revenge plot in a row, only this one doesn't have one of the worst events in the entire story to actually back it up. Another add-in we see here is their whole journey through the metro. From a setting perspective, I think this one was really cool, and the brief bits of environmental storytelling with things like the watermarks and the dollar note, which just continues that Commonwealth juxtaposition, was also awesome. What I really don't like is just how stilted the rest of the story feels. Negan, or Maggie, really pick your poison, feels like this constant ankle weight just dragging the rest of the story down. Take this scene right here. Everyone is just kinda standing around as Maggie delivers her monologue to Negan. The exchange itself is perfectly fine and makes sense, but the rest of the scene just feels really wrong. In some of the inside episode material, Angela Kang also talks about how they wanted to push this Maggie-Negan conflict to its limits. But like, I'm sorry, you already kinda did that in Season 9 where Maggie decided not to kill Negan. We have this massive cast with so many stories we could tell, but we just keep circling around this duo for years on end. If you really wanted to keep Negan around, why couldn't we pair him up with someone else? Like, why didn't he go to the Commonwealth? He's pretty persuasive, isn't he? So yeah, all of these scenes do kinda make me roll my eyes, and it just gets worse when we have the scene of them standing around like NPCs. I have to say though, on this side of the story, we do get this beautiful moment of seeing the night sky and Daryl just looking at the dollar. It's this beautiful moment of natural beauty after the horrors of this man-made dark tunnel that was the Metro, as well as a perfect lead into the Commonwealth story where the meaning of the single dollar becomes so much more twisted. But goddamn, this did not need to be 2 episodes long. Why is this a 2-parter? What I can absolutely get behind is the Commonwealth story. In both versions, they are immediately interrogated, but in the comic book, the whole process goes far more smoothly. They are still questioned a whole bunch, and Lance is actually there in person, but it's nowhere near as intense as in the show. And also right from the get-go, yes, Lance does exist in the comic book, but for all intents and purposes, just think of Lance in the TV version as a unique character. If all of you are fine with it, we can just call him Saul Goodman in the TV version. I guess we can also do Slippin' Jimmy, so I don't know, you decide. And on that note, I think the show here did an S-tier job of expanding this entire introductory period, and I think made the correct decision of not yet introducing Lance himself. All things considered, I can definitely see how you could say that the whole 7 hours of interrogation, the whole reprocessing facility, and the entire spookiness that happens here is a little bit overplayed. I mean, this is still the apocalypse and not some dystopian sci-fi universe, but still, I absolutely loved it. Things like Ezekiel calling out Mercer with what I'm pretty sure is meant to be a sort of a fourth wall break with the whole Stormtroopers description.
All they had to do was give you a pumpkin-colored spacesuit.
Also, the whole strategy of questioning them over and over to suss out fake stories, as well as the entire mirroring of Woodbury. I think all of this was just really cool. The princess also absolutely shines here, with her being able to discern between the guards, notice their patterns, etc, etc. I think it was just a really good natural extension to her character and how she views people. In the same way Negan knows exactly which buttons to press on people, the princess also is just really good at picking up what people do. The one and only nitpick I'd raise here is just how quickly they managed to outsmart the Commonwealth soldiers. I mean, sure, there is the argument to be made that they just picked at the weakest link. But even still, it feels a little contrived considering just how overwhelming this force was meant to be. In that sense, I think the comic did a much better job of selling this "there is absolutely no way out" vibe once we came face to face with them. I think the whole point of them having these rifles and all of this armor is meant to completely eclipse the Negan introduction. I think this was Kirkman very explicitly telling us that with this group, there is no uprising, we are not fighting them at all. And that is exactly why I keep raising this point of the later seasons feeling like our main cast are like the only player characters surrounded by NPCs in the story. Most of the Savior War, the cave incident, the attack on the hilltop, even the food mission we just talked about, and a dozen other things are pretty glaring examples of that. To put it in a different and more abstract form, I feel like with the early seasons, the world was sort of designed to make our characters lose. With the later seasons, on the other hand, it feels like the world is actually designed to make our characters win. Aside from that though, I think the show definitely started off on the right foot with the Commonwealth story. And the final thing I want to talk about today is the group coming across the
Wall of the Lost.
In the book, this entire thing happens while they're already riding into the Commonwealth, with Lance and the entire military being with them. And also, side note, another thing we see here is the Commonwealth just straight up taking on an entire horde, which I think was Kirkman very explicitly wanting to showcase their abilities. They see a horde of walkers, they just march right in. But yes, in the books, it is Michonne noticing a message from her daughter and immediately demanding to see her. Like we've talked about before, this part of her story is explored a little more in the Telltale games, but we'll leave all that for next time. The show, of course, doesn't have Michonne, and the TV version of Michonne doesn't even have daughters. So in the show, we see Yumiko notice a note from her brother. I mean, obviously, Yumiko is a far newer character, so we are nowhere near as invested as we are with Michonne just finding one of her daughters. That said though, and we'll of course talk plenty more about this, I think her story was handled just about as well as you could reasonably expect. And one more thing, purely as a storytelling tool, this sort of Wall of the Lost in the Apocalypse is just a perfect, super depressing plot device, and I love it. That said, this is where we'll pick up next time. Now that the Negan storyline has been completely wrapped up in the books, we should be moving at a far more reasonable pace and diving headfirst into the Commonwealth and the many twists and turns we see with good old Saul Goodman. As usual, do let me know all of your thoughts on the opening of Season 11 and the season as a whole, be it the sudden announcement that this would in fact be the final season, the Reapers, or whatever else. All that said, I hope to see you back next time for the now final stretch of the Walking Dead retrospective. And that's the video. Not going to lie, my excitement levels for The Ones Who Live is reaching some very alarming proportions. I am very much hoping it turns out to be excellent, and I'll be forced to put out some unplanned videos even before we wrap up the retrospective. And on that note, a few important bits of information you might be interested in. We have recently gotten some rumblings from Kirkman himself about his interest in making an animated comic version. And while I definitely don't think you should get excited just yet, I do think it is a very positive development. I talk about it a bit more on the second channel if you're curious about that, but yes, I do think it is a good sign. And also, a few people have raised the idea of me streaming my reactions to The Ones Who Live, so let me know if that's something you're interested in. But again, all of that lives on the second channel. All that said, I want to say a massive thank you to our current patrons and YouTube members who allow me to produce even more of these for you all. And let's also give a warm welcome to the newest members of the team: Ocean Man, Jake the Snake, if you're watching this, check your patron DMs by the way, Full Metal Gayhead, Runarkson, I guess, something like that, Guy Thompson, and Chase Davis. Without you, there'd be a whole lot less of my ramblings, so seriously, thank you. Other than that, I want to say thank you very much for watching, I hope you have a great day, and hopefully, I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye!